This is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. We're back for part 6 of our response to the interview of Mr. Solberg at livingwaters.com. This podcast we're reviewing is linked in the description. In the first few parts of this series, we addressed many comments by Mr. Solberg. In the last couple, we addressed many comments from the guys at livingwaters.com. Today, we're picking up from part 5, where Mr. Solberg continues in the conversation. Let's begin. Mr. Solberg said, "So what I do, I have a framework that I call principle and expression. Very similar to what you said, is that there is an unchanging law of God, right? God is unchanging, but His people change. We've grown over time to know more about Him, because He's revealed more about Himself over time." So right here, Mr. Solberg admits that just as Yahweh doesn't change, the Torah doesn't change either. I'm not sure he understands the magnitude of what that means. If it doesn't change, it doesn't change. It is and will always be the instructions Yahweh established for His people through Moses. Always. If one tries to say the law is done away with, then the law has changed. It would cease to be the instructions for His people. But the law itself shows how it is to be for all generations at the time He had Moses write it down. Just as we showed before how Passover and the Sabbath, and so much more found in the Torah, are declared as a lasting ordinance and covenant. It won't be changed. The Torah is forever, and it will be taught in the millennium as we see here in both Isaiah chapter 2 and Micah chapter 4. As you can see, these verses are almost identical. And Mr. Solberg, please know we agree with your comment when you said, we've grown over time to know more about Him because He's revealed more about Himself over time. With each passing covenant, Yahweh revealed more of the Torah in that new covenant. For example, in Numbers 15, we see the instruction to wear tassels on the corners of our clothes. But at the same time, we know Adam and Eve didn't have that command. Why? Because they didn't have clothes, and there weren't other nations that didn't know Yahweh. So with each passing covenant, Yahweh revealed more and more of the Torah. Now, how much of it was revealed at each new covenant? We don't really know. But when it came time for Moses to write it down, Yahweh said there was to be no adding or taking away from it, implying at the covenant under Moses, He had revealed all of it. Thus, Yeshua taught Moses and instructed His disciples to do the same. Mr. Solberg continued, and also, He's taken activity. He's taken action into the world. So if we want to say the new covenant is identical to the old covenant, then what did Jesus do? There's no reason for Him to show up. First, Mr. Solberg, as noted earlier in the series, Jeremiah shows it's a different covenant. As he said, it won't be like the first one. However, the law is the same. Nothing new is added, and nothing is taken away. What's new is that Yahweh places it on our hearts. That's what's new about the covenant. But then you said, then what did Jesus do? There's no reason for Him to show up. This is where a lot of people miss the purpose of why Yeshua came. Many will say the reason Yeshua came was to ultimately do away with the law because we couldn't keep it, even though we're specifically told we could keep the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 11. And think about it. We're told in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4, that Yahweh is upright and just. All his works are perfect. This being the case, how could an upright and just God judge his people for not keeping his instructions they never had the ability to do? Does that sound like an upright and just God to you? Remember, both the northern and southern kingdom of Israel were judged because they didn't keep his commandments. Would any parent give their child a task they knew the child couldn't do and then turn around and punish them for not doing it? Of course not. But that's what people believe who say Israel couldn't keep the Torah. They believe Yahweh gave them instructions they weren't able to follow, and then he judged them for not following those instructions. So they continue in that belief and say Yeshua came to bring a new covenant that does away with Yahweh's instructions. They believe that's the whole reason why Yeshua came. But Yeshua told us why he came. He came to save the lost sheep of Israel. He said it himself. Matthew 15:24. He answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. He came to restore Israel. He came to begin bringing the two sticks back together again, as prophesied in Ezekiel 37. Because I believe Ezekiel 37 is so important and so overlooked by the modern day believer, I'm going to read from it here. But as I read it, please remember the words of Yeshua and how he said he came for the lost sheep of Israel. Please keep this verse in the back of your mind as we read from Ezekiel 37. Ezekiel 37, starting in verse 19. Say to them, this is what sovereign Yahweh says. I am going to take the stick of Joseph, which is in Ephraim's hand, and of the Israelite tribes associated with him, and join it to Judah's stick, making them a single stick of wood, and they will become one in my hand. Hold before their eyes the sticks you have written on, and say to them, this is what sovereign Yahweh says. I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. This is why Yeshua told the disciples to teach the nations, the Gentiles, what he taught them. He was starting the process of bringing his people back to him. Continuing in verse 22, I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. There will be one king over all of them, and they will never again be two nations or be divided into two kingdoms. They will no longer defile themselves with their idols and vile images, or with any of their offenses, for I will save them from all their sinful backsliding, and I will cleanse them. They will be my people, and I will be their God. Notice it says how they will be one nation in the land. This is all about keeping his promise to Abraham. He spells it out even more as we keep reading. Verse 24, my servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. They will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. They will live in the land I gave to my servant Jacob, the land where your fathers lived. They and their children and their children's children will live there forever, and David my servant will be their prince forever. Please notice Yahweh says they will follow his laws and decrees, just like we see prophesied with the new covenant in Jeremiah 31. And here we see it spelled out specifically how this is the fulfillment of the covenant given to Abraham in Genesis 15. Ezekiel 37 shows this promise finally coming to pass. The children of Abraham living in the land Yahweh gave them. And don't forget who Yeshua said the children of Abraham are. Those who do what Abraham did. What did Abraham do? He followed the Torah. Continuing in Ezekiel 37, verse 26. I will make a covenant of peace with them. Remember, this covenant is with the two sticks, the two houses of Israel, as noted in Jeremiah 31. Continuing, it will be an everlasting covenant. I will establish them and increase their numbers, and I will put my sanctuary among them forever. My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. The nations will know that I, Yahweh, make Israel holy, when my sanctuary is among them forever. And please know, these verses are all given immediately after the revealing of the resurrection in the first part of the chapter, as seen in verses 12 through 14. It's at the resurrection when the new covenant begins. Thus, the marriage noted in Revelation. This will be the restoration of all things beginning as noted in Acts 3:21. That includes bringing his people back to his eternal ways, the Torah. Mr. Solberg continued. So one of the analogies I give in a recent video I made on my YouTube channel was the idea of blood atonement. So, as soon as the fall happened, God's unchanging principle of blood atonement for sin began. We see it first hinted at in the garden when God clothed them with the skin of animals. So there's this little hint of bloodshed cause of the sin. We must remember that Yahweh is omniscient. He knows everything. Since he knows and knew the future, he provided for the future before it happened. Thus, the provision for the fall was already in place before the fall happened. Thus, the provision of sin sacrifices were already in place, just not needed beforehand. Yahweh's omniscience alone shows how his Torah was established long before he had Moses write it down. Thus, Abraham followed the Torah long before Moses wrote it all out. Mr. Solberg continued. Then you have Passover, which happened before the law was given, where there needed to be blood put on the door. Then you have the temple laws, where there are actual blood sacrifices. And then to Christ. So, in a sense, we can say we still have a sacrifice today, but it's an eternal sacrifice. Hebrews 10:10 says, once for all. So, we're under that sacrifice, that eternal sacrifice. First, Mr. Solberg, the Passover in Egypt happened before the Torah was written down, not before it was given. As already noted, Abraham followed Yahweh's instructions long before they were written down by Moses. Next, you said that Yeshua's sacrifice is an eternal sacrifice. Where do we read that it's an eternal sacrifice? Well, we don't. In fact, in that same chapter we read this, Hebrews 10:26. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. These verses right here do away with your theory of Yeshua's death being an eternal sacrifice. To understand the purpose and need of Yeshua's sacrifice, please see our teaching, his sacrifice. Mr. Solberg then continued, but there's still blood, like we read in Leviticus, I think 17:11, that the life is in the blood, and I've given it to you for atonement. So now we are under Christ's blood. But to your point, it's expressed differently, never changed. God's still requiring that, but he fulfilled it himself. So why would we go back? This is where we see Mr. Solberg give a basic misunderstanding of Yeshua's sacrifice. He said, why would we go back? Implying Yeshua's sacrifice replaced all the sacrifices found in the Torah. But it didn't. It must be understood that the Passover sacrifice is not a sin sacrifice. Nowhere will you find in the Torah that the Passover is a sin sacrifice. Yes, Yeshua's sacrifice pays for our sins, but not because it was a sin sacrifice as prescribed in the Torah, because Passover is not a sin sacrifice. As I've said many times before, we can't properly understand the New Testament if we don't understand the Old Testament. If you're trying to understand the New Testament with the mindset that Passover is a sin sacrifice, you are truly missing out on so much depth in the Scriptures. His sacrifice paid for something the law did not have provision for. Persistence in rebellion. This is seen in Numbers 15, verses 30 and 31. If persistent rebellion or just simple obstinate rebellion occurred in someone, they were cut from the community. It was because of the defiant sinning and hardened heart of the northern kingdom that Yahweh divorced them. The law provided no sacrifice to bring them back into covenant once they were divorced and had been with another. This is seen in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Once they were divorced, they were not able to come back into covenant because of their harlotry. There was no provision for them in the law to come back. Thus, the need of Yeshua's sacrifice. Acts 13:38. Therefore, my brothers, I want you to know that through Jesus, the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. Through him, everyone who believes is justified from everything you could not be justified from by the law of Moses. His sacrifice provided a way for us to come back into covenant. There are no sacrifices in the law for this. His sacrifice happened once. Thus, why we see the Bible say, once for all. It will not happen again. So, if someone rebels again after coming to Yeshua, there is no sacrifice left for that person. We see this in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 4 through 8. The Torah gives no provision for them. They will be eternally condemned. So, Yeshua's sacrifice did not replace anything found in the law. It simply was the reality of what Passover was a shadow of, a replacement sacrifice because of coming judgment. Nothing in the sacrificial system was replaced. So the sacrificial system will still be in place when he returns. Again, to understand this, please see our teaching, His Sacrifice. It's only a 16-minute teaching, but it explains a lot. The teaching referenced within that teaching as being the longer teaching to expound on it more became the eternal covenant. But the teaching, His Sacrifice, is truly foundational in understanding why and how Yeshua's sacrifice pays for our sin. Mr. Solberg then continued, because a lot of the Hebrew roots folk will say, when the temple is rebuilt, they are assuming a real physical temple will be rebuilt. Actually, Mr. Solberg, we don't assume that. Yahweh gave that to Ezekiel. You may consider reading Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48 and how it explains the temple will be rebuilt and the Aaronic priesthood will be serving in it again. Thus, the law will go forth from Zion, the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem, as noted earlier in Isaiah and Micah. Continuing with Mr. Solberg's comment. Then, even one told me that there are beautiful animal sacrifices will be renewed. I was like, beautiful? Those are like bloody reminder of our sin. You know what I mean? Those are like scapegoats for the things that we have done wrong. Mr. Solberg, if you study the Torah, you'll see that not all sacrifices are sin sacrifices. There are sacrifices that are free will offerings and fellowship offerings. Then you will have the prescribed sacrifices at the feast days and the sacrifices for consecrating the altar and the priests. But even still, Yeshua said nothing would disappear from the Torah until heaven and earth pass. Thus, all the Torah will be followed in the millennium for those who are not a part of the first resurrection, but survive the tribulation and enter the millennium in their current physical bodies. This is covered in our teaching titled The Second Exodus. Mr. Solberg continued, so if we can't accept Christ's atonement, then we've thrown everything away. You know what I mean? So then you run into, there's another bulletproof. I would say that to someone. Then they would say, okay, the atonement's different. Okay, then the law of Moses changed. No, it's unchanging. You can't add to it or take away from it. Eddie then responds with, because they say it's eternal, right? Then Rob replied, right. It appears Mr. Solberg is saying if one pursues the Torah, they aren't accepting Yeshua's atonement. If that's his implication here, nothing could be farther from the truth. As already noted, Yeshua's death didn't do away with the ways of the Father. His death enables the lost sheep of Israel to return back to the ways of Yahweh. It's at this time in the conversation that Eddie goes into a small discourse on Islam. So we're just skipping that element since it doesn't apply here. Then Eddie continued, yes, God's eternal, but how can this other thing be eternal? I can imagine they might say something along the lines, well, it's part of his character, and his character's eternal, so that's why it's eternal. Rob then interjects, and that's valid, I think. Oscar then replies, yeah, it's eternal to a degree, but in the way that we interact with it, because of the different covenants, our response to it looks very different. Oscar, if something is eternal, then it's eternal. There's no degrees of eternal. As the Psalms say, Psalm 119:89, your word, O Yahweh, is eternal. It stands firm in the heavens. Psalm 119:160, all your words are true. All your righteous laws are eternal. So they aren't eternal to a degree. No, they are eternal. And we don't, as you say, interact with it differently. One either obeys the Torah or they disobey it. And don't forget, Yeshua calls all who disobey it workers of lawlessness and tells them to depart from him. Well, that's all I have for part 6. We'll pick up from here next. So think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.